Hi, this is Avi, and today we will be discussing mixture problems. Mixture problems are an important application of the skills that we've been building up in Chapter 2. And there's some examples in Chapter 2.7, but a lot of the time it helps to have a little more explanation than is in the book. Now, before you go through these slides, you're going to already want to be fluent in solving linear equations, and you should have already read through Chapter 2.7 just for an introduction to the discount and mixture problems as well. Alright, now on to the general recipe for dealing with mixture problems, and more generally any type of word problem. The overall approach is actually pretty intuitive. First, you're going to want to start out by reading the question carefully. Reread it again if you have to, more than twice even, to make sure that you understand what it is you want to find. After you've read the question over carefully, then define the needed variable or needed variables. Try to keep it to as few variables as possible to make things simple for yourself. Right? So always try to minimize the number of variables that you have. After you've read over the question and defined the variables, then you're going to want to extract the information that's buried in the words of the word problem into some sort of organized form, such as a table, and then to build an equation from the relationships there. After you've got an equation, then you can solve that equation using your experience with linear equations. And last, you can finish up by checking the work for reasonability to make sure that it doesn't violate any sort of common sense constraints. Alright, so let's look at the problem now. An investigator is looking into reports of Willie doing money laundering. We're going to try to figure out how much money Willie has, even though we don't have access to his bank statements. So we do know that Willie invested some money into Fund A for 1 year, some amount of money into Fund A for 1 year. And we know that he invested $3,000 more than that amount into Fund B. So some money into Fund A, $3,000 more than that amount into Fund B. Now we know some side pieces of information as well. 18% interest for Fund A and 15% interest for Fund B. And last, the piece of information that's going to be critical in tying this together, the total from interest is $3,750. So $3,750 is the total from interest. And what our goal is going to be is to find out how much Willie invested in each fund. Okay, so we've got all this information, some money in Fund A, $3,000 more than that amount in Fund B, 18% interest for Fund A, 15% interest for Fund B, $3,750 for the total from interest. And it's very confusing having all this information laid out in text. So what our approach is going to be is we'll define some variables, build a table, and then extract an equation. And that'll help us organize this all. Okay, so let's start organizing all that confusing information that we have in text into more manageable form. Now, if you remember last chapter, and you also had some introduction in Alex and on the quiz, we introduced defining variables and writing expressions involving variables. Our variables that we're going to define are usually going to be related to what we want to find. Otherwise, if we already knew them, we wouldn't need variables for them. So for us, we're going to let X be the amount of money invested in Fund A. Right? And notice that we wrote that down in a complete sentence. It's not optional to write it down in a complete sentence. We've absolutely got to write that down in a complete sentence there. Alright? And I want you to remember that $3,000 more than the amount of money invested in Fund A was also invested in Fund B. $3,000 more was invested in Fund B. Now, it's tempting to make up another variable, and we'll talk about that later in the class, but we can keep things simple for now by just writing an expression instead. Alright, so I want you to think of what an expression is involving X and 3,000 that represents how much money is invested in Fund B. An expression that involves X and 3,000 that represents how much money is invested in Fund B. Okay, so pause the slides if you need to. And you should have come up with x plus 3,000. If you didn't, you might want to go back to Alex and review those problems a little bit. Alright, so let's just summarize what we have so far. We've got x dollars invested into Fund A, and we've got x plus 3,000 invested in Fund B. Alright, so now we're going to go on and put this information into a table. Okay, so now we're going to put all our information into a table, or generally just any sort of organizational tool will do. Let's look at the structure of our table just a little bit before we get started. We've got a table here that has a couple columns, the things along the top, and we've got some sort of amount column. We also have a percentage column, in this case that's the interest, and last we have a column that's going to be the two things multiplied together. In this case that's the interest amount, in other words the amount of money that we get from interest. For the rows of the table, the things along the sides, we've got each of the two funds, more generally just what we're interested in, and then last we have a total. Now we're not going to need all the entries in this table. If you notice there's a couple entries that are not needed, and we just filled those in with not needed to represent that we don't know them. But we are going to need the other ones. So let's start filling in the information in the table now. We've got Willie invested X into Fund A. So all we need to do to start filling in our table is take X and put that in for the initial amount for Fund A in our table. Alright. Willie invested X plus 3,000 into Fund B. So again, same story. We can just take that and put it in our table as well. Alright, so filling in the table initially is pretty easy after you've come up with the variables and variable expressions. Now also we've got 18% interest. We're going to put that in as a decimal into our table in the interest column. And Fund B gave us 15% interest. So we're going to put that in as 0.15 in our column. One more easy piece of information, the total amount of money that we got from interest is $37.50. So we put that in for the entry in our table that represents the total amount of money that we got from interest. Alright, now that was all the easy pieces of information, but finishing it up, since we have the structure so nicely set up, is not so hard either. The amount of money that we get from interest for each of these two funds is just the investment times the interest. So for Fund A, the amount of money that we get from interest is going to be the amount invested, X, times 0.1x. And so we just fill that in for the amount of money that we get from interest for Fund A. Now for B, it's the same story. It's the amount invested times the interest. And we fill that in for the interest amount. Notice those parentheses there are not optional. They've got to be there. Right, and now we can take a second to look back and reflect at our table, see how everything's organized now, so that we're going to be able to use the relationships that we understand to extract an equation and be able to solve for x. So we've got all our information organized nicely into a table, and because it's so nicely organized, it's going to make this much easier to extract an equation with very little effort. The key observation here is that the amount of money that we're getting from interest for Fund A plus the amount of money that we're getting from interest for Fund B is equal to the total amount of interest. Right? It's just like if you had two jobs, your total income would be the income from one job plus the income from the other job. And the two added together would be your total income. Alright, so the amount of interest that we get from Fund A is 0.18x. And then if you add that to the amount of interest that we get from Fund B, then that is going to be equal to $37.50. Okay, so the amount of interest from Fund A, we have an expression for that. And then the amount of interest from Fund B, add those two together, and you get the total amount of interest. And now we've got an equation that we can use our skills in solving linear equations to actually solve. Okay, so I've put up all the computation here at once for solving the equation, and you can review this at your leisure. It goes through the same process that we've been using in the first part of Chapter 2. We identify the variable that we want to be solving for, x. Then we use the distributive property to remove the parentheses and expand things out, combine like terms, and solve for the desired variable, in this case solve for x. So we identify the variable we want to solve for, just use the distributive property if it's applicable, combine like terms, and solve for the desired variable. Right, and in this case we end up with x is equal to 10,000. Right, so go through that computation slowly at your leisure. Alright, so now that we've found out all the information, we're going to state our solution. Remember, we found that x equals 10,000. Now, what does that mean if we want to state this? X equals 10,000. Well, remember, x was the amount of money invested in Fund A. It's very easy to lose track of what these variables are. That's why we write them down with a complete sentence to help ourselves. We also have x plus 3,000 in Fund B. X equals 10,000 tells us is that we've got 10,000 invested into Fund A and 13,000 invested into Fund B. We might also ask ourselves very roughly if this makes sense, and so if you think about $20,000 invested at 15% interest, that should give $3,000 in interest. So $20,000 at 15% interest would give $3,000. Our amount of interest is a little bit more, and our investment is a little bit more, so we should end up with more, and we do. Alright, so let's pull this all together. Pulling everything together, we've got 10,000 invested in Fund A and 13,000 invested into Fund B. And we can double check that this answered all parts of the question. So just to review our overall approach, after reading the question, we defined the needed variables. We extracted the information from words into a table. We also extracted the equation from that table as well. We finished up by solving the equation, and finally checked our work for reasonability.